$350 million is how much extra taxpayers are expecting to give to Illinois' K through 12 schools. It's all part of the evidence-based funding model. If you recall, you've been following this for years. It was a debated issue for years until all of a sudden it passed with bipartisan support to increase the amount of funding each year till all schools are fully funded by $350 million every year. Now, the state hasn't hit that mark every year. The past few years, I believe they have. And of course, with COVID-19 relief dollars, that's something very much that is expected to help get to the fully funding of schools, K through 12 schools. But how do we go about using the new $350 million that's expected in the coming fiscal year? It's the WMAY morning news feed. I'm Greg Bishop at 712. In a meeting to talk about some of the proposals on how to spend that additional $350 million for K through 12 schools. It was supposed to take place today, but it's actually been postponed to next week. And this is with the Illinois State School Board, the Board of Education, and their professional review panel. And on the professional review panel, you've got a whole bunch of education officials and experts and state lawmakers. And I talked with a couple of the state lawmakers on that panel on both sides of the aisle. Republican State Representative Avery Bourne, who we'll hear from coming up. But I also talked with State Representative Will Davis, a Democrat from Hazel Crest. And he talks a bit about the review panel and some of the things that they tackle here when it comes to the proposals to spend an additional $350 million in the evidence-based funding model. So here's some of the conversation I had with Will Davis last week when it comes to this professional review panel and their suggestions and their proposals.
One thing that I am very happy that the within the professional review panel, and mind you, I'm an ex officio member, so there are 4 legislators who sit on it, but we are ex officio members, so we're not actual voting members. But I think our presence there helps to offer context, to show some direction as it relates to how that review panel wants to move forward what would otherwise be legislative initiatives, to make changes, overall changes to the formula or tweaks to the formula, things of that nature. So being there is great for me, and we help to guide kind of some of the direction of the professional review panel. So again, I'm just an ex officio member. But one thing that I'm pleased with the review panel is that they have more or less suggested that everything that they do has to be looked at through the context of race and equity. Because again, if you believe the intent of the changes in the school funding formula were to identify those schools who are under-resourced, a lot of those schools are in Black and brown communities and also rural white communities. So again, the schools that don't have, the idea was to put them at the front of the line and so that they would get access to the resources first. And then as more resources became available, it would impact other schools so that everyone could benefit. But there are just some schools who do have enough local resource, and have the ability to continue to provide high quality education as a result. But they really wanted to examine things through the lens of race and equity. So that's where some of the categorization that you just mentioned in your statement about looking at equity, looking at inclusion, looking at how we're servicing kids of color, providing additional opportunities, particularly for kids in those under-resourced schools. It's all kind of centered around that, because we feel that if they are, the ones that need it the most, the only way that we succeed as a state in its entirety is to make sure that we bring up the kids that are at the bottom. And it's not a leveling of the playing field where you're trying to take something from the top and give it to the bottom. Let's just acknowledge that we have to put those resources where the bottom is in order to bring them up. And in doing so, you do uplift all young people in the state of Illinois. Because again, you've got some districts who are very well resourced and are doing great things with the education, quality of education that they provide. And we want to make sure that every kid has that unique opportunity to be exposed to a high quality education. That's what the school funding, the intent of the school funding formula is, it was, or should I say that's what the intent of the school funding formula is. and it's continuing to try to do that. And this review panel, which is a wide cross section of advocates, educators, administrators, yeah, I mean, you name it, they touch this review panel. It's all about trying to make sure that we're providing the best and high quality education to every kid here in the state of Illinois. So that's what they've been focused on, and I appreciate that focus.
So that's State Representative Will Davis, Democrat from Hazel Crest. He is also the chair of the House K through 12 Appropriations Committee, and he's part of this professional review panel that's set to give their recommendations December 13th to the Illinois State Board of Education. That meeting was supposed to be December 6th, was postponed to December 13th. It should be said that the meeting was delayed to give the group more time to solidify their findings. But this all concerns $350 million of additional funding that's set to go to the K through 12 schools. Some of the recommendations they have include things like teaching a foreign language. But there are also suggestions for interventions to have a focus on racial dynamics, equity, and increased bias awareness for teachers. The draft proposals, quote, recognizes that students of color do not inherently need additional supports by nature of their race or ethnicity, but that these students do face inequities because of historical and existing structures, and there's a cost attended with working to dismantle those inequities through training of anti-racism and eliminating implicit bias within schools and districts. And to do that, the professional review panel looks to direct specific costs related to implicit bias and anti-racism at a fixed per pupil cost overall enrollment, with additional per pupil dollar amounts for all students where a district serves more than 50% non-white students. So again, this is how to spend an additional $350 million, more from State Representative Will Davis.
And of course, we always have to be mindful that if we're talking about, like, you know, the money that we get from the federal government, again, we can't just put it into our regular formula distribution. They have indicated that if you're going to distribute that money to schools, you have to use a formula, a Title I formulary, which is a low-income formulary. And every school in the state claims to have low-income students. So even the wealthiest school in the state of Illinois gets Title I dollars because they do, in some of those communities, have poor students. And so they will get some of those resources as well.
But this professional review panel has had some criticism. We talked with State Representative Avery Bourne several weeks ago when this draft proposal was put out, and she worried that it's seeming to divert away from the core function of schools and teaching things like English and math, which recent data has indicated that the state's not doing too great in. Yeah, COVID-19, remote learning may have impacted that to a degree, but still something that a lot of students aren't proficient in, like, for instance, algebra or English and these types of things. But to that criticism, Representative Davis responded.
Well, I don't think you can ever divert attention away from reading and writing. I mean, that's the bedrock of education. So, I mean, and so when you talk about things like this assessment data, that's why, again, why it's important. Because while you're talking about maybe all the nuanced things that go into this, you know, new terminology, you know, new foci in terms of how you're kind of dissecting the students, if at the end of the day they can't read or write, then we're failing anyway. So I don't think you ever get away from reading and writing and arithmetic, so to speak. That's the bedrock of education, no matter what. So again, she's also talking about, now again, let's from my perspective, let's examine possibly some of the schools that she's talking about. So her schools probably are not going to be black and brown schools. Her schools are going to be homogenous, probably rural white. Okay, so some of the things that we're talking about with that focus on black and brown kids is not going to necessarily impact her because that's not the demographics of schools in her district primarily. So, which means that, again, rural white schools who do benefit significantly from the school funding formula are going to take those resources and put them where they feel that they are needed most. And if she feels that her school districts need reading and writing and that's where they need to focus those dollars, then I'm sure her superintendents, her administrators, and her districts will do just that, which means they are not getting away from reading and writing. Now, for me, if you kind of flip that in for, say, districts that I represent who are underserved, we're saying that, our young people need to be exposed more to technology. So our districts are going to, put some emphasis in technology areas to help students grow and to help learn. But again, if you can't read or write, then what good is putting money in technology? So I don't think you ever get away from that. Despite what she's saying, I don't think you ever get away from that.
So again, that's
Ever.
State Representative Will Davis, Democrat from Hazel Crest, chair of the House K through 12 Appropriations Committee, discussing proposals to bring about different types of bias awareness, bias training, anti-racism types of funding structures for an additional $350 million. We will hear next from a conversation I had with State Representative Avery Bourne to respond to some of that and more. So stay tuned. It's here on the WMAY Morning News. All right, we're back with the WMAY Morning News feed. We heard from State Representative Will Davis. Here is just a bit of what he had to say of the idea of how to spend more than $350 million for K through 12 schools. Here's what he had to say.
About looking at equity, looking at inclusion, looking at how we're servicing kids of color, providing additional opportunities, particularly for kids in those under-resourced schools.
So what about the Republican side of this? Well, I talked with State Representative Avery Bourne, and she reacted a bit to some of Representative Davis's thoughts on how to spend an additional $350 million. And in particular, she reacts to Representative Davis talking about how some schools are more disadvantaged than others. And here's what she had to say in response.
I would say I'm not the one pitting schools against each other in this. We have a school funding formula that Representative Davis and I worked on and helped build together that looks at the unique needs of each district. That's the strength of what we have right now. We need to fully fund that formula more quickly rather than adding new cost factors to it that will ultimately drive up the cost of education, push us further into the future before we're funding schools where they need to be. And we need to look at this from a statewide perspective. Many of the changes that are being pushed, I believe, are being intended to send more money to the Chicago school system first, rather than to the schools that this is designed to. Our current system funds schools that need it most first without prioritizing any single district. And I think changing it would distort the intention of the model and I think further politicize something that was a bipartisan win. The school funding formula was a bipartisan win, and further politicizing that, I think, is a disservice to kids.
What Avery Bourne, Republican state representative from Morrisonville, feels that is politicizing things is by setting up different types of funding mechanisms to go towards schools with certain populations of individuals in their ethnicity. To focus on anti-bias and anti-racism training and a variety of other different types of new terminology. And I think we're going to have to go through and start unpacking a lot of this terminology because there's things like affinity groups, for instance, that ISB's looking to set up for teachers. But what are some of these proposals? State Representative Avery Bourne sounds off a bit.
Yeah, so they have proposed adding a new cost factor that could Chicago would be one of the only schools that would qualify. And so when we start doing things like that, we get into the old territory of the Chicago Block Grant and other special deals that were cut in order to send more funding to Chicago first. So once we've dug into it, it seems that that might be the intention. And so we need to look at what helps schools statewide, every school's individual needs. And I'm not interested in individual carve outs or special deals that are done under the guise of being politically correct or, serving students. As Representative Davis mentioned, he wants to pit schools against each other. I'm not interested in that.
So again, I'm sharing some of the conversations I had with both sides of the education funding debate. We're hearing now from State Representative Avery Bourne, who also talks about some of the data that was released with the school report card last week, showing that students aren't doing too great in math and science all across the state. And those are the types of things that Bourne believes should be utilized to make decisions on how to fund schools moving forward, especially when you're talking about 350 million additional dollars.
Yes, it's important that we have both, you know, good resources going to schools, a funding formula that works, getting students the education that they need, but there has to be the accountability and transparency on the back end. And that's kind of the purpose of these kinds of reports is to give people data to make good decisions at the local level and at the state level moving forward. And so there are opportunities to dig in, obviously, into individual schools, individual districts. And so having that opportunity for transparency in this, I think, is really important to drive decisions, not just at the state level, but school boards and parents and others.
So that's IllinoisReportCard.com, where you can delve into those specific school level data points about academic success or even academic failure, how much it costs per student, the amount of violence there may be in a school district, and a whole bunch of other indicators as well. Again, IllinoisReportCard.com. But all of that, including suggestions from a professional review panel on funding things for anti-racism and anti-bias training and possible affinity groups, what all that means, we'll have to continue to unpack here on the WMAY morning news feed. So I greatly appreciate you guys chiming in here. You can always reach me, bishoponair@gmail.com, or find me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Just search out Bishop on Air. All right, now 7:34, and